Welcome back to another deep dive. We always love getting your source material, and this time, oh man, this is some seriously fascinating stuff. We're going deep into the world of, well, diseases, I guess you could say. But not just any diseases. We're talking about the ones spread by vectors and those lurking in the soil, the bacteria and viruses that can really, shake things up.
Absolutely. And, when we say shake things up, we mean it. We're talking about historical epidemics that wiped out huge chunks of the population and, of course, the ongoing battle we face today. The material you sent over, a chapter excerpt, I believe, really digs into the nitty-gritty of how these tiny but mighty pathogens spread, the impact they've had, and really the ongoing struggle to keep them under control. It's a pretty wild ride through, well, a microscopic world that's had a truly massive impact on human history.
No kidding. And you know what? We're going to break it all down for you, nice and clear. That's what we do here on the deep dive. Extract that core knowledge and make sure you walk away with those key insights, all without getting bogged down in the weeds. We know you're busy people and you want that knowledge fast but also thorough, so let's get to it.
Right on. So, where should we begin?
Well, I think we have to start with a name that still sends chills down the spine. A name synonymous with devastation and fear. The plague, or as it's infamously known, the Black Death.
Yeah, the Black Death. A pretty heavy topic to kick things off with.
For sure, but it's essential, right? I mean, just think about it. 75 million people, that's the estimated death toll. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of it, but it immediately highlights something super important, a truth we have to confront when talking about these diseases. The immense and lasting impact a single tiny bacterial disease can have. Civilizations have crumbled because of these microscopic invaders.
And you're spot on. The excerpt dives into this, and it's a bit grim, but it lays it out clearly. The plague, with its horrifying progression and symptoms, is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It's a gram-negative bacterium, which I know might sound like scientific jargon, but it's actually crucial because it tells scientists a lot about the bacterium's structure and how to target it with, treatments. And of course, we can't forget the infamous vector, the critter that helps spread the disease.
The rat flea.
Yeah, the rat flea. Always makes you itch a little just thinking about it, right?
No kidding. But what's really captivating is that our understanding of the plague's origins, when it really took hold and became this global threat, it's evolving. The science is uncovering new information all the time. And that's where the excerpt gets really, really interesting. It turns out researchers are combining archaeology, digging up the past, literally, with this cutting-edge analysis of ancient DNA. It's like they're piecing together a puzzle, and what they're finding is that those highly virulent forms of Y. pestis, the ones that cause the most severe disease, well, they might have emerged much earlier than we thought, like way back 6,000 years ago, around the same time as those early large farming settlements in Eurasia were popping up. Some of these settlements were massive, housing up to 20,000 people.
Right, exactly. And imagine the conditions back then, right? 20,000 people living in close quarters. Not exactly the pinnacle of hygiene, I'd imagine.
Oh, yeah. You can bet sanitation was a challenge, to say the least.
Right, and that's what makes this research so compelling. It's not just about tracing back a single origin point for the plague. It's suggesting that there might have been multiple lineages of Y. pestis circulating way back then, some of which have probably gone extinct over time. And that's a really important insight. It shows that the way we live, how we organize our societies and interact with the environment, has a huge influence on the emergence and spread of these deadly pathogens.
Yeah, so you've got these dense settlements, maybe not the cleanest places, and then, boom, new trade routes start popping up. Think about it. Animal domestication, metallurgy, the invention of the wheel, all these things are subtly connecting these populations in a way that's never been possible before.
It's almost like, building a superhighway for a disease to travel. The excerpt actually suggests that this might have played a role in the decline of some of those early agricultural settlements in Europe. It's a pretty stark reminder that even these microscopic organisms can shape the course of history, right?
Absolutely. And yeah, the excerpt then goes on to make this fascinating comparison with some more recent pathogens that have caused quite a stir, things like Ebola and Zika. The death tolls may be different, but the pattern is similar. Rapid emergence, significant disruption, a real challenge to how we live and interact. It makes you wonder, are there certain underlying factors that make societies more vulnerable to these sudden outbreaks? What are the common threads there?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And one that researchers are always trying to unravel. But for now, let's switch gears a bit, move from bacteria to the world of viruses. The excerpt delves into this fascinating category of animal-transmitted viral diseases, and while they might be less common than those spread by, say, insects like mosquitoes and ticks, the excerpt makes it clear. Some of them are incredibly dangerous, especially once symptoms appear. And the poster child for that, the one we all know, is rabies.
Rabies, yeah. It's a scary one. And what's really unsettling is that even though we have effective vaccines for it, rabies still kills tens of thousands of people globally each year. It really highlights the challenges of controlling these zoonotic diseases, the ones that can jump from animals to humans.
Exactly, and the excerpt defines that term for us. Zoonosis. It's a disease that can spread from animals to humans, and it can happen in different ways. Direct contact, breathing in those tiny particles, or, as is classic with rabies, through bites. And, wild animals, they're a particular concern because, well, they don't exactly go to the vet for checkups and vaccinations, do they? So they can become these long-term reservoirs for these diseases.
That's a good point. And the excerpt then throws in a couple of terms that, well, might be new to some listeners.
Yeah.
Enzootic and epizootic, if I'm understanding this correctly. Enzootic is like the baseline, a disease that's always present at a certain level within an animal population.
Right.
But when things get out of control, when the disease explodes within that animal population, that's when we call it episodic.
You got it. A perfect explanation. And in the U.S., when we talk about rabies, the main culprits, the enzootic reservoirs, are those familiar wild creatures. Raccoons, skunks, coyotes, foxes, and oh yeah, can't forget those bats.
Oh, yeah. Bats always get a bad rap, don't they? But it makes sense, right? They're out there in the wild, interacting with all sorts of creatures.
Absolutely. And while domestic animals can definitely contract and transmit rabies, it's mainly circulating within those wild populations. But let's talk a bit about the virus itself, the culprit behind all this. Rabies is caused by a rhabdovirus. Now, that might sound like a mouthful, but what it means is that it's a specific type of virus with a single-stranded, minus-sense RNA genome. Now, think about it this way. The virus's genetic material, those instructions it needs to replicate, they're encoded in this RNA. And to make copies of itself, the virus needs to hijack the host's cells. And rabies, well, it has a chilling target. The central nervous system in warm-blooded animals, including us, and the tragic part. Once symptoms show up, it's almost always fatal.
And it's spread through saliva, right?
Right.
Like a bite from an infected animal, or even if that infected saliva gets into your mucous membranes.
You got it. It's a pretty direct route. And what's fascinating, or maybe terrifying, is that the incubation period in humans, the time between exposure and symptoms, it can vary wildly.
Wildly. Like, how long are we talking here?
Well, it can be as short as a few weeks, but in some cases, it's been documented to be 9 months or even longer. It all depends on a bunch of factors, the person's overall health, how big and deep the wound is, where it is on the body, how much of the virus got in. It's a bit of a lottery, sadly. And, this is in stark contrast to domestic dogs, where that incubation period is usually less than 2 weeks.
So once that virus gets into the brain, things go downhill pretty quickly, right? The excerpt mentions the thalamus and hypothalamus, specific regions of the brain, as being particularly affected.
Yeah, and that's when you start seeing those classic devastating symptoms. Fever, the pupils getting all dilated, excessive salivation, anxiety goes through the roof. And then as things progress, swallowing becomes a nightmare. It triggers these horrific throat spasms, and that's what we call hydrophobia, the fear of water, which is so strongly associated with rabies. It's truly awful. And in the end, it's the respiratory system that shuts down, leading to paralysis and ultimately death. It's not a pretty picture.
It's not. But the good news, and there is some good news here, is that the vaccine, the rabies vaccine, it's remarkably effective in domestic animals. That's why in developed countries, human cases are thankfully pretty rare these days.
Absolutely. But when a potential exposure does happen, the diagnosis and post-exposure treatment, it's pretty involved. First off, if possible, they need to examine the animal involved. And for any domestic animal that's bitten someone, a 10-day quarantine is mandatory. They need to watch for any signs of rabies in that animal. But if rabies is suspected, or if they can't rule it out, then the person who is bitten, they're going to get what's called passive immunization.
Passive immunization. Now that sounds a bit intense. What does that actually involve?
Well, it means they inject ready-made antibodies against rabies, called rabies immune globulin, directly into the wound site and also intramuscularly. It's basically giving the body an instant boost of those rabies-fighting antibodies. But it's not just that. They also get a course of active immunization with the rabies vaccine. So it's like a two-pronged attack, giving the body both the immediate tools to fight the virus and then stimulating the immune system to create its own long-lasting defense.
So a 1-2 punch against rabies, that's pretty reassuring, knowing there's an effective treatment. But of course, prevention is always the best strategy, right? Vaccinating domestic animals, making sure people who are at high risk, like vets and animal researchers, are vaccinated, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Prevention is key, and that's why those inactivated rabies vaccines are so important. They're available for both humans and domestic animals, and those pre-exposure vaccinations are highly recommended for anyone working with animals or in areas where rabies is a concern. And you know what's really interesting? Researchers are even experimenting with oral rabies vaccines.
Oral vaccines, like how does that even work?
Well, they basically put the vaccine in food baits and distribute them in areas where those wild animal reservoirs are found. The idea is to try and build up immunity within those populations and hopefully reduce the spread of the virus.
That's pretty clever. I also read in the excerpt that there are some regions in the world that are completely rabies-free, like Hawaii and Great Britain. And they've got these really strict quarantine protocols for any animals brought in from elsewhere, to protect that rabies-free status.
Yeah. It's a reminder of how important those preventative measures are, to keep those diseases at bay. But unfortunately, on a global scale, we've still got a long way to go. Despite the vaccines and all the efforts, rabies still claims nearly 60,000 lives every year, mostly in developing countries in Africa and Asia where access to vaccination for domestic animals is, well, it's limited.
Yeah, it really highlights the global health disparities, right? It's a reminder that not everyone has equal access to the healthcare and preventative measures that many of us take for granted. And it's pretty sobering to think that an estimated 14 million people worldwide receive that post-exposure treatment each year. It shows just how widespread this disease still is.
It does. And, just when you think you've covered all the ways rabies can spread, the excerpt mentions this rare but, well, concerning possibility of transmission through organ and tissue transplants. Remember that case back in 2013 in the U.S. where a kidney donor was later found to have had rabies? It's a chilling reminder that even in these seemingly unrelated medical procedures, we have to be incredibly vigilant.
Vigilance is key. And speaking of vigilance, let's move on to another group of animal-transmitted viruses, and these are some serious ones. The hantaviruses. We're talking about two pretty nasty diseases here. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS for short, which wreaks havoc on the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. And then there's hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, HFRS, which can lead to shock and kidney failure. And guess what? Both of these are spread by infected rodents.
Oh yeah, hantaviruses, they're not ones to mess with. And the name itself, it comes from the Hantian River area in Korea, which was the site of a major outbreak of hemorrhagic fever back in the day. These viruses, they're similar to the flu virus in some ways. They're enveloped and have this single-stranded minus-sense RNA genome, but they're actually more closely related to other nasty hemorrhagic fever viruses like Lassa and Oropouche.
So, lots of scary company then. And if I'm reading this correctly, these hantaviruses, they can infect quite a few different rodent species, right? Mice, rats, voles, lemmings, they can all carry it. And the creepy part is it doesn't seem to make the rodents sick. They're just going about their business, spreading the virus.
Pretty much, yeah. And humans, well, we become those accidental hosts. And how do we get infected? We breathe in dust or aerosols contaminated with the virus from, get this, rodent droppings, urine, or saliva. It's not exactly the most pleasant way to get sick.
Definitely not. And the symptoms, man, they sound rough. HPS hits you fast, sudden fever, nausea, muscle aches, and then your platelet count plummets while your white blood cell count goes up. And you can get hemorrhaging, internal bleeding. But the scariest part, the fluid that builds up in the lungs, that can lead to systemic shock, heart problems, and even death from suffocation or heart failure.
Yeah.
And get this? It can all happen within a matter of days.
It's a rapid progression, and the symptoms can vary depending on the specific strain of hantavirus you're dealing with. Some might cause kidney failure, others might have different effects. It's a bit of a, well, a scary lottery.
So with HFRS, the other one, is it a similar story?
Well, it's definitely serious, but the symptoms are a bit different. You're looking at intense headaches, pain in the back and abdomen, problems with the kidneys, and then, those hemorrhagic complications, the bleeding. And interestingly, the excerpt points out that HFRS is more common in Eurasia, while HPS is more prevalent here in the Americas.
So different parts of the world, different hantavirus risks. And the death rates, are they similar between those two diseases?
Actually, there's a pretty big difference. HPS, that's the one that's more common in the Americas. it has a much higher mortality rate, about 40%, whereas HFRS, the one more prevalent in Eurasia, typically has a mortality rate of 1 to 15%. So yeah, a significant difference.
Big difference, for sure. And, when we're talking about these really dangerous pathogens, it always makes me wonder about the scientists who study them. How do they even work with these things safely?
Well, that's where those biosafety levels come in. The excerpt mentions that working with hantaviruses requires BSL-4 precautions. That's the highest level of biosafety, putting them in the same category as, well, some of the nastiest pathogens out there, like Ebola.
Yeah, the big leagues of dangerous viruses.
Exactly. So we're talking about specialized labs, highly trained personnel, strict protocols. They don't mess around with these things. And, there's a reason for all this caution. The 1993 outbreak of HPS in the Four Corners region of the U.S., that was a wake-up call. It showed how environmental factors, things we might not even think about, can contribute to these outbreaks. That year, a mild winter followed by a ton of rain in the spring led to this massive boom in the deer mouse population, which unfortunately meant a spike in human cases of HPS. The mortality rate for that outbreak was a terrifying 56%.
Wow, so almost like a perfect storm of conditions that led to that outbreak. It's a good reminder that we're all part of this delicate ecosystem, and changes in one area can have a ripple effect on human health. So since 1993, have there been many other HPS cases in the U.S.?
Well, thankfully not on that scale. Since '93, there have been around 728 cases reported, with a consistent mortality rate of about 36%. Most of these cases have been in the western states. But globally, it's a different story. Estimates suggest around 200,000 hantavirus infections occur each year, primarily in China, Korea, and Russia. But thankfully, the overall mortality rates in those regions are generally lower than what we see with HPS here in the Americas.
So different strains, different risks, different parts of the world. It's a complex picture. But what about treatment? Is there anything we can do once someone's infected with a hantavirus?
Unfortunately, there's no specific antiviral drug or vaccine available yet, so treatment is mainly supportive, focusing on managing the symptoms, keeping the patient comfortable, and giving their body the best chance to fight the virus. Isolation is important to prevent further spread, and they focus on things like rest, fluids, and pain relief. But really, the emphasis has to be on prevention, limiting contact with rodents and their habitats as much as possible.
So basically, keep those mice and rats at bay.
As much as possible, yes. And that involves a few key strategies: disrupting their habitats, making sure food is stored properly in sealed containers so they can't get to it, and when necessary, implementing those rodent control programs. And, studies have shown that in areas where there have been outbreaks, a significant percentage of the rodents are carrying the virus. So taking those preventative measures is really crucial.
Sounds like good advice to me. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, I want to touch on one final category of diseases mentioned in the excerpt: those spread by arthropods. We're talking about those pesky mosquitoes, ticks, and their relatives, right?
Exactly. Arthropods are a huge category, and many of them can act as vectors, transmitting all sorts of nasty bacteria and viruses to humans.
And how does that usually happen? Is it just through bites?
Yeah, a bite from an infected arthropod is usually how it happens, and in most cases, humans are considered accidental hosts. The real reservoir, the main host for the pathogen, is often the arthropod itself. We just happen to get caught in the crossfire.
And the list of diseases these little critters can spread is pretty extensive. The excerpt mentions a whole bunch of them: rickettsial illnesses, yellow fever, dengue, Lyme disease, chikungunya, Zika, and even, if you can believe it, plague can sometimes be transmitted by fleas.
Yeah, they're a versatile bunch when it comes to spreading disease, and the consequences can be pretty severe, sometimes even fatal.
Not exactly the kind of hitchhikers you want to pick up. Well, this has been a truly fascinating and at times pretty terrifying deep dive into the world of infectious diseases. We've gone from those historical scourges like the plague to those modern-day threats like rabies and hantavirus, and even touched on those tiny but mighty arthropods that can cause so much trouble. Hopefully, you've walked away from this with a better understanding of these diseases, their impact, and how they spread, all without getting lost in the details.
That's always the goal. And it's important to remember that all these things are interconnected, right? Human activities, animal populations, even the climate. They all play a role in the emergence and spread of these diseases. It's a complex web, and finding solutions requires a multifaceted approach.
Could have said it better myself. And, this leads me to a question for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, those historical epidemics, the ongoing challenges of zoonotic diseases, those disease-carrying arthropods, where do you think we should focus our efforts? What are the most pressing areas for future research and preventative measures? It's a complex problem with no easy answers, but one that demands our attention and, well, maybe even a little bit of ingenuity.
Absolutely. Food for thought.
Well, on that note, a big thank you to you, our listener, for providing this incredible material and sparking this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new insights and, perhaps, a healthy dose of respect for those tiny organisms that can have such a massive impact on our lives. And as always, we're eager to see what other topics you might want to explore with us in future deep dives. Until then, stay curious.